An 8-year-old girl's simple question stopped an entire town hall in its tracks, and left Donald Trump sharing a heartfelt and deeply personal story about losing faith and finding redemption. What unfolded next brought tears to everyone's eyes. The Church Fellowship Hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, was alive with soft murmurs and the gentle scraping of folding chairs across the polished floor. Normally used for Sunday potlucks and Bible studies, the space had taken on a very different atmosphere that evening. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump, his well-known presence filling the modest hall. His distinct orange-hued complexion and signature hand gestures were instantly recognizable to all. But tonight, there was something different about him. He seemed quieter, perhaps aware of the seriousness of the occasion. The audience was a mix of families, retirees, and local residents, all curious to hear what he had to say. Among them, though, one figure stood out, not because of her size, but because of her quiet determination. 8-year-old Lily, dressed in her finest Sunday dress, clutched an old, leather-bound Bible tightly against her chest. The Bible, a cherished heirloom from her late grandmother, had faded gold lettering and worn pages, each one steeped in memories. Her mother, seated beside her, had whispered before they arrived, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough, and only if you truly mean it." Lily had nodded, her heart pounding as she prepared for the moment she'd been anticipating for weeks. She had practiced her question endlessly, scribbling it in her notebook during recess and murmuring it to herself before drifting off to sleep at night. It wasn't just a question born of curiosity, but one that weighed heavily on her young heart. As the evening went on, Trump spoke on his usual topics: policies, achievements, and America's future. The crowd occasionally clapped or nodded along, but the energy felt subdued compared to his typical rallies. Meanwhile, Lily waited, her small hands gripping the edges of her Bible tighter with every passing moment. Finally, the floor opened for questions. A line quickly formed as adults eagerly stepped forward to discuss local issues, national policies, and even throw in a few compliments about his iconic red tie. Lily hesitated, sinking further into her seat. But a gentle nudge from her mother reminded her that this was her chance. Her legs wobbled as she stood, her heart pounding so fiercely she was sure everyone could hear it. The line seemed impossibly long, but as she moved forward, the chatter in the room began to die down. People started to notice her, a small girl clutching an oversized Bible. Whispers rippled through the crowd. When her turn finally arrived, Trump's gaze landed on her. For a moment, his expression softened. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his tone unexpectedly kind. Lily's fingers tightened around her Bible, her knuckles turning white. She swallowed hard, then, in a trembling voice that refused to falter, asked the question that had been on her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room instantly fell silent, completely silent. Eyes darted back and forth between the young girl and Trump, the weight of her question settling heavily over everyone like a palpable force. For a man known for his quick responses, Trump didn't answer right away. He simply looked at her, then at the Bible she held, and something in his demeanor changed. Before he could speak, the air in the room seemed to hum with anticipation, drawing everyone to the edge of their seats. Trump's silence was almost deafening. For a man who had built his career on quick comebacks and unwavering confidence, this pause felt unusual. He stared at Lily for what seemed like an eternity, his typical bravado replaced by something gentler, almost vulnerable. His eyes drifted to the Bible she held, its worn leather cover speaking volumes, and his lips parted, but no words came. Lily shifted slightly, her small frame appearing even more delicate under the collective gaze of the room. Her question wasn't meant to challenge or provoke. It was a sincere inquiry born of a deep desire to understand something far greater than herself. And that honesty, it spoke louder than any heated debate or campaign slogan ever could. The crowd remained hushed. Even the usual creaking of chairs or muffled coughs seemed to disappear, as if the very air was holding its breath. Finally, Trump raised a hand slightly, as though steadying himself, and leaned into the podium. "That's a big question," he began, his voice steadier and lower than usual. "And it's not one I've always had an answer to." The admission caught many off guard. The man known for his unshakable confidence was now confessing uncertainty in front of a crowd. He looked back at Lily, his expression softening further into something almost paternal. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had a lot of questions about God, too. My parents took me to church every Sunday, and I remember sitting in those pews, staring at the stained-glass windows, wondering if God could even hear me." He paused again, scanning the audience as though measuring their reactions. His hand rested on the edge of the podium, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "My father used to say," Trump went on, "that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, even when you're scared you might fall. You keep climbing because there's something up there worth reaching for." He let out a faint chuckle, the tension in the room easing just slightly. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the audience, breaking the heavy silence for a brief moment. But Lily didn't smile. Her wide, earnest eyes stayed fixed on him, waiting for the answer she had come to hear. Trump leaned forward, his tone softening even more. "But as I got older, life threw me a lot of challenges. I faced losses, failures, and moments when I wasn't sure I could keep going. During those times, I didn't always feel like God was there. Sometimes I was angry at him. Sometimes I thought maybe he'd given up on me entirely." The room remained spellbound. This wasn't the polished rhetoric or rehearsed talking points they were used to. This was something raw, something real. "But I'll tell you this," Trump said, his voice gaining strength. "Even in my darkest moments, when I felt completely alone, I realized something. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about believing that even when you don't see the full picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work." He glanced at Lily, whose grip on her Bible had loosened just slightly. Her tearful eyes shone under the fluorescent lights. "And God to me," he said slowly, "is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we stumble, even when we fail, we're not finished. He's the voice urging us to keep climbing the ladder, even when we think it might break." As his words hung in the air, Lily's eyes filled with tears. The room stirred, murmurs breaking the silence as the crowd sensed something extraordinary was unfolding. Lily's tears fell silently at first, a single drop slipping down her cheek as she clutched her grandmother's Bible tighter. Then, her shoulders began to tremble. The whispers around her grew louder, but no one dared to interrupt. Her mother instinctively leaned over, resting a gentle hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered softly. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness. It was something much deeper. Trump's words had resonated in a way she hadn't anticipated, touching a place in her young heart she had long kept guarded. Trump, noticing her reaction, stepped away from the podium. His expression was unusually subdued. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a beautiful name," he said, offering a faint smile. "You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. And sometimes, those questions remind us of what really matters." Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes locked on his. "My grandma used to say that, too," she said softly. "She said God is always listening, even when we can't hear him." Trump's expression flickered with something unspoken, admiration, perhaps, or understanding. He took a deep breath and turned back to the crowd. "This little girl just asked a question most adults wouldn't dare to," he said, his voice steady. "What does God mean to us?" It's not an easy question because it forces us to look inward. It makes us confront our fears, our doubts, and our flaws. The room was utterly still. In that moment, Lily wasn't just a little girl holding a Bible. She had become a symbol of something much bigger. Her courage had transformed the evening, shifting it from a routine town hall into a profound reflection on faith and humanity. "We live in a world," Trump continued, his voice softer now, "where we're always searching for answers outside of ourselves. We think success, power, or money can fill the gaps, but..." The room quickly fell silent again, waiting for what would come next. Trump straightened, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. His voice, quieter but firm, carried the weight of someone who had walked through doubt and found meaning on the other side. "You see," he said, his gaze sweeping across the audience, "faith isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. It takes courage to admit you don't have all the answers, to admit you're struggling. And it takes even more courage to keep searching, to keep believing, even when life doesn't make sense." The crowd stirred, nods of agreement rippling across the room. Trump's tone softened as he continued, "We live in a world that rewards certainty, that values confidence above all else. But the truth is, the moments that shape us the most are the ones when we're uncertain, when we're on our knees asking for guidance, for help, for hope." He turned back to Lily, his expression gentle. "And Lily," he said, "you reminded me of that tonight. You reminded me that sometimes it takes the bravery of a child to ask the questions adults are too scared to face." The room erupted into soft applause, but Lily's eyes stayed locked on Trump. There was a quiet pride in her expression now, her tears dried, her small frame radiating a newfound confidence. She looked up at her mother, who smiled at her, her own eyes glistening. As the applause faded, Trump leaned back into the microphone. "And for all of us here," he said, "let this be a moment to reflect, not just on what we believe, but on why we believe it. Faith isn't about having every answer. It's about holding on, even when the questions seem too big." The audience seemed to hold its collective breath, the weight of his words sinking in. For a moment, it felt like everyone in the room, no matter their background or beliefs, was connected by a shared understanding of struggle and hope. Trump took a step back, his expression thoughtful. "And if there's one thing I've learned," he said, "it's that even in our darkest moments, even when we feel completely alone, we're never really abandoned. There's always a purpose, even if we don't see it yet. And that's what faith means to me." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that carried an unspoken agreement. This was more than a speech. This was a moment of vulnerability, honesty, and connection. As the event slowly wound down, Lily and her mother made their way toward the exit. But before they could leave, Trump stepped down from the stage and approached them. He knelt slightly, so he was at eye level with Lily. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but full of sincerity. "You didn't just ask a question tonight. You reminded all of us what really matters." Lily nodded, clutching her grandmother's Bible tightly. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. Trump smiled, standing tall again as he watched them leave. The room slowly began to empty, but the atmosphere lingered, charged with the memory of a little girl's courage and the unexpected vulnerability of a man many had thought they already knew. That night, as Lily climbed into bed, her grandmother's Bible still clutched in her hands, she whispered a simple prayer, "Thank you, God, for letting me ask." And as she drifted off to sleep, a quiet sense of peace settled over her. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that her question had made a difference, not just for her, but for everyone in that room. It was Lily's voice that broke through next. My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds, she said, her words clear and steady despite her small frame. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. Trump smiled, a genuine, almost tender expression that seemed to transform his usually guarded demeanor. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, he said. And she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see. The conversation seemed to breathe new life into the room. People began to nod, share glances, and whisper quietly to those sitting beside them. What had started as a structured town hall had shifted into something far more personal, a shared reflection on life's challenges, doubts, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, raised her hand next. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice soft but steady. "It's never too late," he said. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes, it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it comes back to you." The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Around the room, others looked equally moved, some dabbing at their faces with tissues, others sitting in reflective silence. It became clear that the evening wasn't just about questions and answers anymore. It was about connection. The atmosphere in the room was electric, not with noise, but with the energy of shared vulnerability. What began as Lily's simple question had opened a door no one dared approach before, and now no one wanted to turn back. Trump straightened, his gaze sweeping the room. "You know," he said, "there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones. The times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what really matters." He gestured toward Lily. "This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about, it's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads." Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's smile widen just a bit more. Trump's tone grew firmer. "We're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences. But faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing the same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths look." A ripple of applause began, slow at first, but gaining momentum. People stood, clapping not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for the courage it had taken Lily to ask a question, and for the answers it had drawn out of everyone in the room. As the applause subsided, Trump leaned in one last time. "So tonight I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you, and don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, then added, "And if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow. And share it with the people who need it most." The room erupted in applause again, this time punctuated with hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by quiet hope. Lily, now standing with her mother, watched Trump step away from the podium. He walked over to her, kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, for answering, Trump stood, giving her a faint smile before turning back to wave at the crowd. As he exited, the room remained alive with chatter, the people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but determined. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." As the hall slowly emptied, the lingering message was clear. Sometimes, the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find the pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.